Thanks for letting me join, Adrian. I really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for making the time to join. I know depending where you are, it's all different times of the day, but no matter where you are, you've made the time. I appreciate that. So thank you. My name is Scott. This is a talk about making product-centric approaches work in the real world. And I guess really it's a story about starting off by seeking structure, but realizing that what's needed often is adaptability and direction. So here's the simple line that I want to start with. A product mindset is more important than a product operating model or framework. Frameworks can be helpful, but they don't travel well. They work brilliantly in some contexts, usually, engineering heavy, software as a service, customer facing, work exceptionally well there. But they often crack when you drop them into complex organizations. What does travel well, though, is a mindset, a way of working that adapts to wherever you are. And that's what I'm going to unpack today. I've been doing this product thing for 20 years, so increasingly feeling like an old man. And when I look back, I don't just see job titles that I held, I see different eras that I worked through. I think about 2005-ish to 2010-ish. That makes me think of digitization, the World Wide Web, and software as a service. So moving professionals from paper and pen to laptops and early software as a service. At the Department for Education, where I was at the time, we were funding laptops, these things called virtual learning environments, e-portfolios, and introducing them to schools. And what I learned then was that technology is easy and it's people that are complicated. And if we look at 2010, 2015, that makes me think of social media and smartphones. So the appearance of the iPhone, Facebook, Twitter. I ran a parent advocacy service at the time, and we punched well above our weight on a national and international level by mastering those tools early on. And for a moment, the technology itself gave us an edge. I think about 2016 to 2020-ish, we've got digital services kind of proving their worth. Leaders wanted more, and digital transformation was the phrase of the day. But at this time, I started stepping outside of the digital bubble, and I realized how small our world was compared to enterprise technology. Scaling wasn't really about slogans, it meant reckoning with a wider system. If I think about 2020, up to 2025 and beyond, I think digital transformation has largely happened now due to the pandemic. Organizations suddenly and dramatically had to adopt the technologies needed for remote work. For a couple of years, the normal rules didn't apply, and we actually got stuff done quite often. And quite often, it was quite fast. So now everyone has the tools. I'm not sure that the term digital is really useful anymore. It's just kind of reality. And the real challenge now is how we work and function given that reality. You see organizations haunted by the ghosts of unfinished transformations, layers of change half introduced but never finished. And here's the problem with product operating models and popular frameworks. They often need a clean slate to work. They require that we start again from scratch. And the truth is that we're way past that in 2025. And I'm not sure it was ever realistic in the first place, to be honest with you. In our world today, copying and pasting someone else's model doesn't really work very well. So the question becomes, how do we make product-centric approaches work in the real world? I think the answer comes down to three things. There's structure. So there is a useful discipline that frameworks, models, and templates provide when we use them in the right places. It's also really important to have adaptability. It's the flexibility of a product mindset. And we also need direction, the orientation we get from understanding the landscape of the organization in which we're at work. If you leave this talk with just those three words, structure, adaptability, and direction, you'll have what you need to navigate the messy reality of lots of our organizations. So let's go into that in a bit more detail. And I want to start by telling you how I came to this realization, because it began with my own search for definition of product management. And I was seeking structure, but what I needed and what I found was adaptability. We'll talk about product mindset. When I started out in products, I wanted a neat description of what the role was, something I could hold on to. And I looked everywhere. There was the Scrum product owner definition, which was kind of too narrow and too tied to one framework. Martin Ericsson created a famous Venn diagram back in the day. Our product was at the intersection of business, technology, and UX. Really, really helpful. Good jumping off point, but too tidy to cover the breadth of the role. Learning provider called General Assembly had a product management course that came over to the UK. And it was polished, but it was still built for software as a service and didn't really work in a world that looked like mine. Even the UK government's product manager role description, which I actually co-wrote, was clear on paper, but didn't capture the messy reality that I saw in practice. None of them worked well enough in my context. This is a photo of me presenting to the CEO of the civil service, talking about the cloud platform that I was the lead product manager for, which powered in-house software for the justice system in England back in 2015. Just think about what I just said. There was no product textbook for that. It was such a mishmash of things. I had to really reach to find some support. And I've kept finding myself in new spaces throughout my career. Platforms, policy, enterprise technology. And each time the question wasn't, what is product management in this description? It was actually, what does product even mean in this space? And that's when I realized I wasn't being pushed towards finding a better job description. I was actually being pushed towards designing a mindset, a way of working that could travel, adapt, and still make sense, even when the terrain kept shifting. And here's the first clue to that mindset: the perspectives needed in a good team. So you've got leadership, which is why we're here, and the impact we need to have. It's not necessarily a leader literally present in the team day to day, but they're represented by either clear goals or strategy, or ideally both. You need somebody to aim the team at the best opportunity to achieve the goal that matters. You need a perspective assembly. So how do you assemble the people and the plans and the tasks needed to achieve those goals? Then, very importantly, you need people to get it done, the people that actually do the work, complete the tasks, and bring it all to life. All things being equal, the product person brings that aiming perspective to the team. And the thing that makes that aiming perspective work is radical focus, naming the biggest opportunity to achieve the goal or outcome you need, and focusing on that, even when everything else feels urgent. Because saying yes to things is relatively easy. A lot of the job is saying no to things that will spread you thin, distract you, and delay you from getting to where you need to be. Fundamentally, aiming and keeping focus on that aim is at the heart of a good product mindset. Let's apply that to the humble backlog. It's a core tool for product management and can feel like a core part of our identity. People often imagine the backlog as a single thing, a list of things to do for the product. But the reality is two things. You've got the product backlog, which is your goals, your bets, your aims. And you've got the sprint backlog, which is your tasks, the things that assemble people and work around those aims. Product backlog is where you decide what to aim at. The sprint backlog is how you assemble it and get it done. So a task is done when you do it. A goal is only done when the outcome is real. So if your goal is to halve the steps in customer registration, it's not done when the web form is redesigned. It's done when you actually can see that customers are taking half the number of steps. And that's what real product looks like in practice. And here's the thing, aligning people around the right goal and saying no to the wrong goals takes time. And if it takes time, it's work. And if it's work, it should be on the sprint backlog. But in so many teams, only design, research, and software development become visible tasks. Invisible work, the alignment doesn't appear. With things like aligning senior leaders with a goal cuts across their agendas, retraining staff, supporting users, making policy changes, fixing referral pathways. They don't appear. And if that work isn't visible, half of reality disappears and you can become a feature factory. The product mindset is about radically aiming at the best outcomes. And that often requires soft skills as much as it does hard skills. I also think of product management in messy organizations, less as mini CEOs, more like scientists. So I once looked at the prior careers of my lead product managers, and the most common background wasn't design or software development or project management. It was science. We had forensic scientists, pharmaceutical scientists, research scientists. I kind of put this down to a weird quirk at the time, but the more I thought about it, the more it makes sense. These are people who know how to enter ambiguity, set up small experiments, manage risk step by step. That's the skill set that product demands in most organizations, not just building stuff, but running experiments, focusing and adapting. These people step into ambiguity, run experiments, and manage risk step by step. That's a mindset that travels no matter what your context. Putting all that together, here's 3 signals of the product mindset I've been talking about. These are things I see in the best teams I've worked with. Number 1, learn in motion. Don't assume, experiment. Test, learn, evolve, and think like a scientist. A lot of the job is helping teams that are stuck to understand that sometimes movement creates clarity. You can't always know and then move. Sometimes you have to move and then know. Number 2, focus on outcomes. Always ask, what problems are we solving? Who are we solving it for? And how will we know it's working? And radically focus on that. Number 3 is build trust, not just tech. A lot of the job is creating the alignment needed to make decisions that matter. This work matters just as much as the work to develop software features. So if that's the mindset, portable, adaptable, outcome focused, why do so many people feel like they're not doing proper product? Because that's something I encounter a lot. People worried that they're doing a bad job or even the wrong job. And often that's where frameworks come in. Frameworks can be useful if we view them as tools, but too often they're viewed as the whole truth. And they're not the truth of product for most organizations. So when we compare ourselves to these frameworks, most of us won't measure up, even if the truth is that we're doing what's actually needed for our context. My first real encounter with a big sovereign framework was at the Ministry of Justice about a decade ago now. They brought in less, which is a framework called Large Scale Scrum. And within 3 or 4 months, it had appeared, been declared a total failure, and quietly disappeared, never to be mentioned again. And it wasn't people's fault. It wasn't even the ideas were totally useless. The problem was that less arrived as a ready-made structure, dropped onto a messy landscape. There were legacy systems, policy constraints, decades of culture. The model assumed clear ground, but the ground was anything but clean. And I've seen the same story play out again and again with other frameworks. These days, my consultancy is often called in after these failures to help teams reorient, repair trust, and get moving again. That's when I realized frameworks do have value. They give you structure, and structure matters. But they're not the whole picture. You can't force the entire landscape to conform to one structure. But here's the key point again. Frameworks are tools, not the truth. They work brilliantly in some contexts. But potentially, if you're engineering heavy, public facing, software as a service, it would work really well. But outside of that, in government, healthcare, large corporates, local authorities, their validity erodes fast. Why is that? Well, most of us don't have the luxury of starting from scratch and wiping the slate clean across our organization. We inherit fragments, organizational debt, and half-finished transformations. That's why structure is a useful tool, but adaptability matters more. This third piece of the puzzle is where orientation comes in. So to recap, structure comes from things like frameworks, role descriptions, templates, and can be useful as long as we know where to use them and what their limits are. Adaptability comes from mindset, which allows us to travel to new places where the old frameworks don't work and the new ones haven't been figured out yet. But direction, which I'm about to look at, comes from orientation, from understanding the organizational landscape we're standing in, where we are within it, where we want to get to. So here's the final piece of the puzzle: orientation. Even with structure and adaptability, we still need to know where we are, because without that, we can't move with purpose. And quite often we start by looking for the products. And it's hard. And the truth is, there might not be any, certainly not neat ones. I've struggled with this myself. I've managed literally dozens of product managers who struggle with it too. There's the endless question of what's the product? We'd sit in workshops debating, is it the website? Is it the platform? Is it the service? Is it the policy? I've seen those debates drain whole teams. People feel paralyzed because they can't put a neat label on the thing they're working on. And I had to realize something. It doesn't matter. The point isn't finding a perfect definition of the product. The point is applying the mindset and being clear about where you are applying it. That's what orientation gives us. It's not about squeezing everything into a product-shaped box. It's about seeing the terrain clearly and naming where we actually are. Once we know that, we can apply the product mindset in a pragmatic and context-specific way. The tool I use for this is something I've come up with called the service landscape. So think of 4 layers. You've got services, the mountains, the big promises an organization makes. You've got experiences, which are the paths people walk to access those services. You've got capabilities, so the tools, process, and functions that make it possible. Then you've got foundations, the bedrock, IT, data, infrastructure, governance. Here's the important thing. In my experience, product rarely lives at the top of the mountains, much more often in the paths, the tools, or the foundations. Orientation is about knowing which layer you're working in so you can apply the mindset in the right way. Let's look at those layers in a bit more detail. The services, the mountains, the big promises an organization makes. Most organizations deliver a small handful of core services, usually between 1 and 5. They're often vast, multifaceted, and define both purpose and promise. I've been supporting lots of higher education organizations recently. Quite often, a university, for example, will have 3 services. There is research, education, and then there's the core staff platform that staff use to run those 2 things. I've also just got back from supporting a financial services organization. They also had 3 services. They had lending, they had saving, and again, they had the core staff platform that ran those 2 things. And as I say, the product mindset rarely leads from the top of those mountains, much more often in the paths, the capabilities, and the foundations, in my experience. Next, let's look at experiences. These are the paths that people walk to access those services. They are products by default, but they can be managed like products. They have users, flows, outcomes, and pain points. Patterns that repeat across these experiences are, you can broadly speaking, split every service into 3 bits. You've got pre-service, awareness, eligibility, application. You've got during the service, so use, participation, updates, and post-service, follow-up, feedback, and closure. Verbs that give these away are often things like explore, apply, enroll, receive, manage. Going further down the landscape, we've got capabilities, and I imagine a lot of you will be very familiar with these, probably talk about these much more knowledgeably than I can. The capabilities, the tools, the processes, and functions that make it possible. They're the tools and shelters scattered across the landscape. Examples are make a payment, confirm identity, manage cases, send notifications, store or retrieve documents. Each capability can be delivered by people, processes, or technology. Some are fragile and bespoke, others become repeatable and standardized, even platformable. And that in particular is when a capability becomes product-like, when it's reusable, stable, and intentional. This is especially powerful in a large federated organization where platform capabilities can often provide some of the best coherence across the whole landscape. Last but definitely not least are the foundations, the underlying conditions that enable or constrain everything above them. And they're often invisible until they crack. Processes, operating rules, back office workflows, escalation paths, all of those things. So examples are IT and infrastructure, hosting, networks, devices, integration layers, data and records, so systems record, quality, interoperability, policy and regulation, so statutory obligations, compliance frameworks, funding and governance cycles, so thinking budgets, approvals, audits, and procurement and contracts, so, suppliers, SLAs, and commercial terms. Weak or rigid foundations mean that the paths crumble, tools break, and mountains become inaccessible. They're rarely glamorous, but they are absolutely critical. I share all of this because orientation is about knowing which layer you're working in, so you can apply the mindset in the right way. The dense dump of information. So I'm going to talk about a real example of testing this out. I recently tested this out with a team in a public sector organization facing a familiar problem, a website rebuild. The contract for their website was expiring, technology was dated, and something had to change. Looking at the landscape together, we noticed a few things. So in the foundational view, in budgets and on the portfolio, this activity was framed as a simple website rebuild. As I say, that makes it a foundational project, just tech work. But these people, they were in the digital division. They'd been set up explicitly to avoid short-lived, output-driven projects. Now, in a different bit of the organization, amongst senior leadership, this work was described as a chance to create the mythical single view of the customer. That made it an experience level ambition, redesigning silos across the organization to create a joined up journey. That is a change program by stealth. Visionary, totally unrealistic within the scope and timeline of replacing the website before its contract expired. They'd love it if their work was the first step towards this grand vision, but knew they couldn't achieve it from their position of authority and empowerment in the 8.5 months they had to do this. They came to the capability space thinking about publishing and realized this was a good stretch, but achievable. What felt stretching yet realistic was to focus on internal publishing. Treat publishing as a centralized capability, consciously design it as a platform. That meant blending technology, a content management system staff could actually use, with organizational change, better ways of working for content creators, better relationships between digital and the rest of the organization. Stretching technology challenge and a realistic scope of organizational change. This is what they felt it needed to be. And they realized that the team, their senior stakeholders, and their portfolio all had totally different views about what this thing was. And they needed to help them align on the same view, ideally within that capability layer, focusing on publishing. The service landscape didn't solve the problem. It helped the team to see where they thought they were, spot that they were in the wrong part of the map, and align on where they should actually be. Let's wrap up and move into some questions. There's more to a product-centric approach than just popular frameworks. And their popularity often alienates product people from the reality of their organizations and their role. Because again and again, I hear product managers saying, I'm not doing proper product. And the truth is that in the vast majority of cases, they are. They're just not doing it in a neat software as a service startup way. They're doing it within a messy, complex organization. That's why I wrote my book, Product in Service. It's my way of giving a language to the reality that most of us work in and show that products in a messy, complex organization is still product, just product in the real world. For me, the way to make product-centric approaches work in the real world is to acknowledge the real world. The structure of product operating models, frameworks, job descriptions, and templates genuinely can be valuable if we treat them as tools and not the whole truth, and understand where they're useful and where they're not. But adaptability and a product mindset is more valuable. It helps us to show up in places where the old models don't work, the new models haven't been figured out yet, and to make good decisions within ambiguity. And direction comes from orientation, from knowing where we are in the landscape, even knowing what the landscape is, and applying the right balance of structure and adaptability for that space. All of this, ultimately, in service of aiming our teams and organizations at the best opportunities radically focusing on those best opportunities to get where we want to be. Thank you. This talk shared sections of my book, which is on sale on Amazon. Please feel free to connect with me and get in touch on LinkedIn. And for my day job, I'm director of product and strategy for Herd Consultancy, where I help clients with everything we've discussed. So get in touch if you'd like to find out more.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Scott. I mean, I can see all the emojis coming in the virtual round of applause. So I can see this has definitely landed. People recognize some of the challenges that you are articulating and some of the things that you've said there. I do want to move on to questions. As a reminder, if you have a question, please do type it in the Q&A tab, and we will cover as many questions as we can. But just before we do that, I really like that expression. I found it. Bouncing around in my head around radical focus, Scott. And it reminded me of what we were talking about immediately before we went live, which I was saying about the difference between writing and editing, and how actually editing is really hard, but editing is what makes a book or anything good, in my view. And as you were talking about backlogs and stuff, I was thinking, yeah, actually, it's the like you say, what you say no to is often more well, or as important as what you say yes to.
Yeah, totally. It's one of the consultants that I've hired to work with me. She talks about it a lot, and it's kind of fallen into my language in the last couple of years. And it's really interesting. So we catch up every week, and whenever we catch up, the question is, what's the deal you've had to negotiate this week? Because every single week, it's how are they helping our client to really, really focus on the one thing that will move the dial, bit space to make a decision about it, then also have a space to mobilize immediately after that decision. Like how does this now reach out into the real world? And the phrase radical focus, it's the name of a book, so I use it as well because it's a good jumping off point into that book. So Christina Wodka, I think is her name, she's got a book called Radical Focus. It does go deeper into things like objectives and key results when you're ready for that, if that's the thing that ends up being useful. But it starts off in more of the plain language description of, yeah, you've got to say no to stuff.
Yeah.
Quite often it's easy to avoid saying plainly, you've got to say no to some stuff.
No, it's really interesting because OKRs was something that was, something that was sort of banging around in my head as you were talking as well. So excellent. Let's go and take some questions now. So do keep the questions coming. First of all, Michelle asks, where the product teams are arranged around platforms. How can organizations share to ensure that core services are delivered consistently? Sometimes it feels like different teams compete with each other rather than collaborate.
Yeah, I'm not smart enough to give the answer that totally sorts that out, but I'm experienced enough to know some things that have helped. So spent a lot of time working in central government, and one thing that central government's done well in the digital and technology space is having standards that are both good and matter. They were so good, in fact, that I kind of hacked them in my organization, and became the departmental lead for them, and really beefed up some of them. So in that instance, one of the standards was about using common tools and technology. And it's really worded as is to just look outwards. Are you building a thing when you should be just buying a thing?
Yes.
Internally, really amplified it so that we used it as a jumping off point to build a list of the internal things. And now this standard was linked to, so I sat on portfolio as well. The standard was a condition of investment being released. So before investment was released in, building a thing, a team had to demonstrate that they weren't reinventing the wheel, in plain language. So having standards that matter and linking them with investment, and having a need to kind of periodically justify the investment you're asking for is one way of building those things together. I should say in that organization as well, I basically helped kick off our platforms division. working with the CTO. So the CTO was the architect of the whole thing, first product lead in that space, and having them all under a single person helped as well. Um, I think more often the challenge was making sure that those platforms worked on trust and relationship management in a federated organization. Otherwise, one agency in the federation just say, you're not meeting our needs, we're just going to do our own thing and totally bypass it. So I think as challenging as it was to keep the platform teams aligned, um, really helping them to focus on relationships and understanding needs and doing the same user-centered design for platforms as you would with public-facing stuff was a challenge. But that's where the standard came in as well. So I
Yeah.
very much use the standard to drive up the focus on users and to think more broadly about how does this work in their lives.
That's really interesting. I like what you said there about a federated organization because that, in reality, is, well, at least in my experience, most large organizations. Because even if you've got, say, different market-facing business units, well, they're usually reporting different lines of P&L, and have
Yeah,
got, literally one can, and you see crazy things happen, like we've probably all seen it, where one part of the organization is investing really heavily in one particular flavor of tech, and the other one is going for a different vendor, and you're like,
yeah.
how is this happening? So, in the chat, Petra mentions architecture, and I just wondered to what extent architecture, and I know we can have a good discussion about what is architecture, story for another day, but like how does that come into play? Would you be having conversations with architects of various flavors?
So this is kind of interesting. So I had never even heard of solution architecture, for example, until about 4 or 5 years ago. Now very, very familiar with it. Um, there were all sorts of architecture that didn't exist in the relatively pure digital world that I operated in, say, 5 or 6 years. There was a single role, which was technical architect.
Yeah.
There were software engineers, and there were web operations engineers. And that was the totality of all technical roles. Obviously, there was slightly more nuance within those professions, but that was it. Um, then, kind of moving into local authority, a council, where I was the first product leader they had. Suddenly, all of the solution architects, all of these different roles, and there it was quite often about tying together portfolio and trying to make it less about micromanaging time, scope, and cost, and really ensuring that technology wasn't the front door to it. The technical design authority wasn't the first thing you hit. And it was actually about making a place for roles like lead business analyst.
Yes.
And it was about coordinating opportunities. So the radical focus thing, that's what I described in that context. Um, Going back to the specific question about architecture, in the kind of pure digital space that I worked in for a while, there would be a technical architect per like federated area, and then they would have a variety of seniorities of software engineer and web operations engineer. The Once again, if it was kind of, I guess, a portfolio design thing, I would really help each business unit to ensure that there was a technical architect with a view across all of their work.
Mm.
Technical architect wasn't expected to sit day to day in each of the individual teams, but was expected to kind of coordinate across them in a space that was still kind of effectively in an enterprise technology setup. It was very much about creating a space with portfolio where the thing that came into the portfolio was an opportunity.
Yes.
It wasn't a requirement, and it didn't become a requirement shaped thing until we said, is this an opportunity that falls within our area of radical focus?
And that's beautiful. I really like that framing, and I like that idea of, an opportunity coming in, rather than a solution or a requirement or whatever. Actually, there's this thing which can be shaped. You mentioned scientists, and actually, if you're being a scientist, or if we're using the analogy of scientists, there's got to be, it's almost like hypothesis-driven stuff, right? It's saying, well,
Yeah,
we we think there's something we can do to achieve that, but what's the smallest possible experiment? I know this is language that many other authors have used. What's the smallest possible experiment we can do to potentially disprove that or to show us which direction we're going in?
I'll give you another
Excellent.
really a kind of tangible, real world, super pragmatic example. So, lead business analyst incubating this opportunity, um, and making sure it hadn't hit architecture yet because it would immediately go to kind of scoping and estimates. And they said, Scott, I think that this would be accidentally illegal. It would compromise our statutory duties.
Yeah,
I don't think they've realised that. And so, over two or three conversations, we ensured it never even hit the portfolio officially, so that there was no reputational damage of it appearing and then going back again. And having that kind of human space for alignment and testing it and treating it as an opportunity, and then just one person going back to one person saying, I think this would contradict our statutory duties and technically be illegal, and allowing
yeah,
it to disappear was incredibly useful. If that had gone straight to technical design authority, it would have very quickly gone to scoping and estimates and stuff, and that would have been a total waste of time and money.
yeah, yeah. Think of the amount of effort that would have got wasted in something that was never gonna happen. So wow, gosh, that's a really nice example.
Yeah.
Excellent. Let's move on to our next question, which is from Petra. So Petra asks, do you manage the foundations, brackets, internal services on the same principles/pyramid as the external services?
Short answer is yes, but you've got more constraints, and it might be a particularly, I don't think of the right word, a particularly varied version of the role. So what I mean by that is, if I'm helping something that was previously called, or even currently is called, like workplace technology, and it wants to make the transition to being more like staff experiences. So how do we focus on meetings and collaboration over just your standard technology towers? You can't just jump to that in one leap. And we have to respect that the IT service management roles remain really valuable and essential now and forever. Managing technology. I remember the person who was managing the contract with Microsoft for the justice system that I need to catch up with in the portfolio. Just that relationship and reconciling the organization's estimated usage versus the supplier's estimated usage, that was a full-time skilled job in its own right. So I think there's a need to retain those towers and the perspectives and the skills contained within them. Incrementally drop in some of the mindset, and ultimately add in cross-cutting teams based on those experiences. But the reason I said it can be a varied version of the role is short term, it might end up being some combination of IT service management and/or business analysis and/or delivery management and the kind of tactical product ownership version of the product management role. And during that transitionary periods, it's it's particularly lacking in the neatness that we might look for in that role. And I've seen a few issues when an organization confuses the vision for moving in that world from workplace technology to staff experiences with step one. So there's suddenly a restructure or an additional headcount to introduce product managers, for example. Landscape is the exact same on that day as it was the day before,
Yeah.
and the conditions are the same. So you either tend towards product managers that get burnt out because they can't do anything like the thing they thought they were hired for, or product managers that tend towards doing a worse job at the IT service management and analysis of the people that were already there.
Definitely, definitely interesting. A lot to think about there, and yeah, 'cause just context. So much context matters in these things,
Yeah,
doesn't it? So,
100%. And it's once again, it's the mindset can still be applied there. I can still, in that context, think, what do we need to radically focus on? And all of the other elements as well. It still tracks. but you will not be doing a neat by the book product management role.
Yeah, yeah. Which comes back to adaptability again, doesn't it? Which is one of the
100%.
key things you mentioned at the very, very outset. So,
Yeah.
um, excellent. We have an anonymous question that has come in, which says, "How does a business architecture concept model to work effectively in the business? How does a business architecture concept model to work effectively in real world to make best sense in product-centric world?" So I'm going to need to do a little bit of interpretation of this question. So if you did type this question and I've interpreted it incorrectly, please let me know. I'm guessing the person is probably referring to like an information concept model, which is a potentially a business architecture or a business analysis output, and whether that has relevance in a product world. Again, if that was your question and I've misinterpreted it, please let me know. But what would your view on that one be, Scott?
My view is that it does have relevance and it often doesn't have relevance. And what I mean by that is the insights contained in that output are relevant and useful. The profession and even that type of an output often is not understood and visible to the people who could find it useful. And so I think there's an interesting thing with business architecture about it being understood by
Yes.
enough people who are doing the work where it is most valuable. I hope that wasn't too um, circular of an answer, but I
No,
absolutely
no.
think that in those spaces it's valuable, but I often don't see it connecting with the people it needs to connect with.
That's it. And I think there's, and I mean, I say this for analysis and other artifacts as well, that sometimes there are things which are useful for a practitioner to communicate some stuff with other practitioners to spot stuff, but that's not necessarily a communication deliverable, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
So there's like sometimes there's a background artifact which can be really useful and can get you moving in a certain direction, but that's not the thing you put in front of the the
yeah.
consumer type of thing. Depends on
To
again, it
answer that
depends
another
on
way,
context.
yeah, if I think in 2015 in a very kind of pure in-house digital team working on platforms which are effectively, it's you platform a capability is my view. Um, Business architecture as a concept didn't exist, even though in theory we were the most suitable place for that perspective to land. I think lots of people wouldn't even be able to tell you what it was, let alone commit that they were making use of it, even though we were effectively looking at what are the relatively lower level capabilities in our control that we can centrally turn into components and platforms.
It's interesting, isn't it? And if I mean, it's interesting because I consider what I do to largely be business analysis, but sometimes people say bits of what I'm doing are business architecture, and I'm like, I do what I need, I do what needs
Yeah,
doing in the context I'm in. But one thing I've found is everyone loves a capability model. I don't really know why that part of the sort of business architecture world has got real traction amongst amongst stakeholders who probably wouldn't look at other artifacts. And I sometimes wonder if it's like, if you're going to make a model, just make sure you can put a RAG status on it because everyone loves a RAG status. So maybe that's the answer to that's the answer to the world. But
100%. And I think if I think about that platform team, that platform division from 2015, I think what would actually have been useful is because business analysis didn't massively, like there was not a single business analyst in that entire division. And I
wow,
think yeah, it just wasn't a part of that team at that time. Um, but that team was lacking an understanding of the its own orientation within the broader organization, which I think are the skills that a good business analyst would have brought. Um, and it was more the case that because there were no platform things, you could pretty much choose any one, and it was a big step on. But a few years on, it probably needed to be more strategic than it was. And once again, that
yeah.
at least one lead BA sat in the management team, I think could have been really useful.
Yeah, yeah. And Petra adds a really useful comment in the chat where actually, probably some were doing analysis, so you may not have had the title. And Petra adds that she's seen that a lot in Dutch government. Um,
Got it.
and yeah, Michelle's just added that I think BAs use techniques to understand and techniques to explain, and that's another element too, isn't there? There's the techniques to understand and then the techniques to explain. Um, so
100%.
quick fire questions now because we're and
Yeah, sure.
if you are still here live, do stay to the very end because I've got a couple of community announcements at the very end as usual. But so last two questions. First, Michelle asks, BAs need to elicit requirements across all four layers of the service landscape. How would you handle a product owner slash manager who is only interested in the services?
Um, well, in my model, services are almost like the. So an example would be, yeah, the whole of the legal aid agency. In my model is a single service. I think a product manager who is working up there. I've supported people who are confusing the layers, I guess, um, and I can see how some product folk might think that they are responsible for end-to-end service transformation, when really the space they have to operate is foundational or capability. Um, and so I don't think I have a neat answer for a quick one, other than the last time I really had to unpick that, I literally used the service landscape model. I ran a workshop on it, and we had like 2 3 hours, and there needed to be hard truths about where
Yeah.
do we sit in the organization, what authority and empowerment do we have versus the influence we would like to have. Um, so I'm sorry that's not quick. It's a trick
Well,
because I think it takes hard truths. Honestly, I'm not sure there's a way around it.
but no, what you're saying really resonates certainly with me. That actually sometimes you've got to sit down and say, well, actually, look, yeah, we know we'd love to do this, but the constraints and the context we're in means that actually here are the levers that we can realistically pull on. How do we best, pull on those levers to get at least closer towards that? Or I suppose the other is how do we amplify influence? But then that's a whole separate conversation. So, um,
I think.
the final question, I think this is probably one of the hardest questions, so I've left it till last,
Excellent.
which is Petra asks, what is your definition of a product, and what is the definition of a service in your manifesto? And like what's the difference? Where do they overlap?
So I can answer that actually quite easily. So I don't think there are neat products. I think sometimes there aren't products. When you're working in a service, there sometimes aren't products. The answer is we just have to get over that. And that's why the mindset is more useful. The service for me is the ultimate release of value. So, as I say, for a university, 3 services, for example: research, education, and the core stuff platform. In government, like I say, legal aid agency, the entire thing is a service. It's everything needed for somebody to receive legal aid. We're going back to it. Yeah, I think it's such a red herring. We're not making soap. We're not constructing trainers. We just don't have products. It's unfortunate that the role is called product management and it's called a product mindset. I think the mindset is the important part. And honestly, it's just a time suck to worry about what is the product sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that is a fantastic conclusion to leave us on. Scott, like before we move towards closing, I am certain people will want to stay in touch with you. They'll want to find out more about what you do at Herd. So how can people stay in touch? How can they get the book?
So the book is on Amazon as an ebook. It is a paperback now as well. If you search either for Scott Colfer or product in service, it will come up. Best way to connect is LinkedIn. Just search for Scott Colfer, or you can do linkedin.com/in/Scott Colfer. Yeah, thank you. Somebody just shared the link. And for Herd, yeah, if you just search for Herd Consulting, dot consulting, you can find out what we do.
Fantastic. And I'm just putting those links in the chat as we speak. So excellent. Well, thank you very much, Scott. A definite virtual round of applause for that really really enlightening session. I know I took a lot from it, and I can see by the emojis and the chat that other people did as well too. Um, thank you again, Scott. Thank you to everyone who attended live or indeed has watched the recording. Just a few very short community announcements. We've got 2 minutes. I just wanted to let you know about the next webinar. Well, there will hopefully be a webinar in October, but I haven't quite nailed down the date yet. But I'm hoping it will be with a business poet. Yes, you heard me correctly, a business poet. If you're intrigued as to what that means, I was really impressed when I spoke to this person and really impressed that they agreed to do a webinar. So watch out for that one. But I can't give you the link for that one yet because we haven't quite sorted a date. However, for November, we have the Cheshire Cat and the Entrepreneurial BA Rethinking Target State with Nick Devoyle. This was a presentation that Nick did at the BA Conference Europe, which happened back in, a few weeks ago. And it was one that I couldn't make because I had a diary clash. So rather selfishly, because I wanted to see it, I asked if he'd do it as a webinar, and he said yes. But that also means that you can tune into it as well. And finally, you will be aware, I'm sure most people on the call will be aware of BA Digest, which is a free quarterly PDF magazine. You can just go to badigest.link and get that. But the important thing is the next edition of BA Digest will be coming out on the 6th of October. So keep an eye out for that. If you're not already on our mailing list, be sure to join that so that you see that as well. But we are just about to hit the half hour. So thanks again, Scott. Thanks everyone for tuning in live. Take care and see you next time. Bye for now.